Hi everybody, I hope you have a big bowl of Cheetos and a nice Diet Dr. Pepper in front of you while we talk about Chapter 9, Television. This is Part 1. This photograph shows the assassination of President John Kennedy in November 1963. That's the president slumped over in the rear seat of the car, and his wife, Jackie Kennedy, crawling over the rear part of the car, trying to get away from the horrific scene that she encountered. A bullet had come in from behind the presidential motorcade and hit the president in the head and killed him. She doesn't know what she's doing now, but she's just trying to get away from the scene, and there are Secret Service agents and police officers surrounding her and some other people who are reacting to the sounds of gunfire as the car passed by. The 1950s and early 1960s were a time where television started to replace radio in the hearts and minds of the American people. And the main thing had to do with visuals such as this. Putting things on television that could capture the emotion and energy of an important newsworthy time in our life was much more compelling to simply listening to the drama on the radio. So I show you this photograph not to shock you, but to make you aware of how much of an important change that television was when it started replacing radio in terms of importance in the 1950s. And of course, we've unfortunately been privy to many more tragedies since then. The Boston Marathon bombing, which is a large photograph in the upper right there, killed and injured many people. The 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Towers in the bottom right, the Challenger space shuttle explosion there in the bottom left, and any number of fires, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. And again, it's possible to tell a compelling story about these events on the radio, but the addition of pictures in film and then video later really made Americans change the way they looked at things. And it continues to this day. You know, obviously, if you look at the photograph taken during the Women's March on Washington down there in the bottom right part of the screen, and the guard standing guard on a part of the wall dividing Mexico and the southern United States in the upper left, and there's Trump with Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau and Hillary Clinton and her sidekick. Her actress that plays her on SNL, Saturday Night Live. So we can talk about what's happening in our culture with television to a much greater degree of criticism, because we can not only hear the sounds of what's going on in the world, we can actually see the way people talk, the way they act, what they're upset about in a much more clear fashion. And, it also spilled over into our entertainment. Big Bang Theory, one of the most popular shows on television right now. Walking Dead, which is the photo stripped across the bottom there, which just returned to television for this season just the other night. And then Game of Thrones, if you're into that sort of thing. So radio always had this rich storytelling tradition. They always had their soap operas, their television programs, their entertainment programs. Television brings that to life in much more spectacular ways, and as technology gets better, television is able to tell it in ways that radio can only begin to think of back in the 30s and 40s. Television started replacing radio as the most popular mass medium in the 1950s, as I said. Of course, there's still overlap. There was then, there is now. But TV has a much stronger impact in the way that it shapes and reshapes our culture. And of course, we can talk in general terms about TV having positive and negative impacts. We can talk about it having studies showing that it leads to an increase in violence, just as music does. It leads to an increase in types of things that maybe aren't the best things for us. It glorifies glorifies drug use and other things like we talked about in the music chapter. But the concept of television actually came about as early as 1876. The idea that we should be able to do more than just hear voices. We should be able to actually see pictures. And it was in the late 1880s that technology to start television started to evolve. So a little bit of technical stuff here. We won't go too heavy duty on this. But there's several names of inventors you need to know. The first is Carl Ferdinand Braun, a German man. There's a picture of him there. And he invented what was called the cathode ray tube in 1897. It's short for that is CRT. And what he did was combine a camera and electricity. In other words, he found a way to have a tube, a blown glass tube like you see there in the photograph, with an anode screen in there. And when electricity was applied to that from a high voltage power supply, it could project an image of that anode on the front of the screen. And of course we see both a physical specimen of what was then a CRT and also a diagram showing how it functioned. Now this is an advanced electricity or mathematicals or mechanical engineering class. You'll just have to take it on my say-so that this was the first invention that really kind of created the thought process for what would become television later on. Another person to know is Paul Nipkow, another German man, who invented what was called the scanning disk system in 1884. And he invented a system where a disk had pinholes or pinpoints of light that ran on a motor, and that when you projected through them, it projected as a series of electronic lines. And there's an example on the far right there on the bottom of kind of what one of those images can look like. These have been, most of these older machines are not in operating order. It's still possible to reconstruct them. I think this might be a reconstruction rather than the original machine. But it was a very primitive way to broadcast, shouldn't say broadcast, to transmit a series of light images into a facsimile of TV. Boris Rosing, a Russian, combined the cathode ray tube and the spinning disc into an experimental television in 1907, and so it was able to transmit crude geometrical patterns. And this is, you can see the cathode ray tube there in the bottom of the picture is kind of a greenish glass thing. And he also inserted that into a cabinet that had a scanning disc, and he was able to get very, very, very crude images. They weren't really moving images so much as they were just images. And in Britain, John Logie Baird put a lot of things together, as well as a lot of other inventors, and did the first public demonstration of television in 1926 in a London department store. Now, there are some conflicting accounts. Some scholars put the first public display of television in 1927, a year later in New York, and the inventor there transmitted the image of a dollar bill. But we're going to go with what's in your chapter here because that's another perfectly good piece of historical information. And you can see that just with even these three people, there were many, many, many other inventors that came along and added bits and pieces, including Philo Farnsworth, an American. He is considered the father of modern television. Now, 1927 doesn't sound very modern, but he actually took it from what was a practical analog type of television to what we would call an electronic television that was powered by electricity. This is a picture of him a little bit later in life, but he actually designed the first television at the age of 14. He was a very precocious guy. He had a math teacher. He lived in a small town. The math teacher told him very early on that his knowledge was not sufficient to help Philo do the inventions, but Philo persevered on his own, did his own calculations, did his own constructions. Very, very, pretty much a genius to put this stuff together, and actually came out with working televisions by 1927, and also worked on inventing television cameras, which is another invention. So, That ends part 1. We're trying to make these segments a little bit shorter. We will see you next time for part 2.